Hello my dear friends, you're on the Military Summary channel. In this short video we're going to discuss the most important events that took place during the previous night of the local time. We have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And the most important things, most important news are coming from Sumy direction. Today the Russian sources, more precisely the Telegram channel Kadyrov 95, this is let's say official channel, Telegram channel of the head of Chechnya, and in this video we can see how the Russians were bombing and attacking the villages and settlements along the border, and based on this video we can make a conclusion that the Russians started something in this direction. In the end of the video we have an episode with the Russian soldier who raised the Russian flag inside of the, let's say, town hall of Ryzhivka, and also the Russians shown the sign of the town hall. And based on this video most of the mappers have adjusted their maps, showing that Ryzhivka is under complete Russian control. So this is the town hall where the Russians raised the flag, and there are some icons and some episodes of how the Russians were moving across the village from the south to the north. So very important video, but we see that lots of mappers, lots of military experts are trying to be very careful with their statements and their conclusions. And the Russians are very careful, as well as the pro-Ukrainians, let's say, experts and neutral experts, because of the situation in Kharkiv area. If you remember, when the Russians just started Kharkiv offensive operation, there were a lot of statements, lots of fake updates, a lot of speculations, wishful thinkings, and many other things, and most of them were about that the Russians were about to capture Kharkiv. But after months of clashes, we see that the front line was stabilized. We don't see any progress from the Russian side. There are very heavy clashes inside of Volchansk, and obviously this is not something that can lead in the future to complete control over Kharkiv. Maybe this will lead to some buffer zone, but obviously not to complete control, at least during the next months or two. Maybe in a year or two the Russians will be able to get some progress, but not for now. So the same story is about Sumy. Nobody understand what is going to be next, whether the Russians are planning to move further or not, whether the Russians have enough of forces or their garrison is limited, as the garrison was limited in Kharkiv direction. So let's discuss in details and let's try to understand what is going to be next in Sumy area, and whether it's real Sumy offensive operation or another attempt from the Russian side to stretch the forces and to force the Ukrainians to redeploy additional forces, let's say from Avdiivka or Kharkiv area to Sumy. And before we start, of course, one of the most important goals, one of the most important thing that the Russians were trying to achieve is to force the Ukrainians to stretch their forces and to redeploy additional reinforcements and reserves from, let's say, Zaporozhye area or South Donetsk direction or Chasiv Yar direction to Sumy. And the thing is that if the Ukrainians are not going to send forces here, most likely the Russians would continue moving further to the south with the purpose to establish complete control over the village by the name of Vorozhba. Because if the Russians are able to capture this village, if you remember we discussed this situation a few days ago, then the Russians will be able to cut the main supply road that goes from Kiev to Sumy. This area will be cut off by the Russians. Now let's discuss details. Most of the mappers and most of the military experts and most of the geolocations you saw were located inside of Ryzhivka. So once again, the flag was established in the town hall, and we have few episodes of how the Russians were moving through the village. But if we return back to the video, we're going to see that there are lots of episodes, and telling the truth, most of the episodes that we can see right now in front of your screen were not located inside of Ryzhivka. Some let's say some synth resources managed to geolocate most of the scenes from the video, and according to geolocations, the Russians were bombing the villages by the name of Volfina. Some episode took place in this area. The Russians were bombing the village by the name of Iskrivshchina. So one episode of artillery strike took place here, another episode of artillery strike from the Russian side took place here, and another artillery strike took place here. So as you can see, the Russians weren't bombing Ryzhivka at all. They just entered the village, and that's it, without any resistance from the Ukrainian side. But from another side, we saw significant number of artillery strikes a bit to the east from Ryzhivka and somewhere in this square. So, and this is the most important part, because when talking about the Ukrainians after the Russians published their video, they start talking about Ryzhivka, that Ryzhivka is not so important, that Ryzhivka was in the gray zone, and either the Russians or the Ukrainians had possibilities to enter the village without any problems because the village was in the gray zone. Of course, let's discuss the statement from official Ukrainian statements about the gray zone in Ryzhivka. Telling the truth, it's a complete fake information, because if we increase the numbers of updates since the beginning of April, we would get significant number of videos and reports from this territory when the clashes were taking place during the battle for Tyotkina. Maybe not in April, maybe in March. Let me check once again. If you remember this year, yes, in March. If you remember, in March of 2024, the Ukrainians made a lot of attempts to attack the village by the name of Tyotkina. We have a lot of reports, we have a lot of videos of how the Ukrainians were raising their flags. Not the Ukrainians, but if you remember, those were the proxy Ukrainian forces. And we have a lot of videos of how the Ukrainians were bombing and attacking the Russian forces. We had the videos how the Ukrainians were storming the area with significant number of infantry. So that village wasn't in the gray zone. That was a well fortified, well prepared territory with significant number of forces. And during the previous days, the Ukrainians were completely defeated in Ryzhivka and were forced to fall back. And now the Ukrainians are trying to show that that was a village in the gray zone. And we have a lot of evidence, a lot of geolocations, a lot of videos from March and April that this information that is spreading right now by the Ukrainians is just wishful thinking and not a real situation. Furthermore, I'll remind you that in May there was additional update from the same area in the vicinity of village by the name of Suja. Somewhere in the middle of May, the Ukrainian sources published the video how they managed to discover and to destroy the Russian convoy. We discussed this video many times. So obviously the Ukrainians knew for sure that the Russians were concentrating their forces along Sumy area, so that's why it sounds very weird that Ryzhivka was in the gray zone if the Ukrainians expected the beginning of offensive operation from this direction. So a lot of questions, not so many answers to these questions, but let's discuss a few more updates from the territory. Also, we have report that the Russians started bombing significantly the village by the name of Yunakivka, the village that located right in front of Suja, the area that a few weeks ago the Ukrainians discovered and destroyed the Russian convoy. And once again, just for statistics and for geolocations, if we increase the numbers of updates, we can see significant number of geolocations published by the Ukrainian sources of how they were FPV droning the Russians in this area. So obviously, regarding the situation and regarding the statements of different sides, different, let's say, parts of the conflict, we see that the Russians did concentrate their forces in this area, and they did or do have some plans for further offensive. And the most important update, maybe not so important about the progress and artillery strikes, but today we have report that power has partially gone out in Sumy and the Sumy region, Ukrainian media writes. So this is very important statement because you need to understand that energy was, let's say, shut down by Ukrainian side, not as a result of Russian missile strike or Russian Gerain strike. Basically, the Ukrainians themselves turned off electricity in some regions with the purpose to reduce the spread of information from the line of combat contact. So when Ukrainians turned off electricity, of course, cell phones, internet was turned off as well. And for now, we can't receive any fresh information about the situation, let's say in the village like Basovka, Yunakivka, Suja, or the villages that the Russians were bombing along with their offensive operation in direction of Ryzhivka. So to summarize everything, to summarize reports we have, currently the Russians most likely are trying to establish complete control over the village like Atinskaya, Halishivsky, Budki, the Yunakivka, the village that Galishivsky, that the village was under very heavy fire, Wolfina, and of course the village by the name of Bezalivka. So this territory, according to geolocations, according to reports we have, is under very heavy Russian Russian fire, and most likely the Russians will try to capture these villages with the purpose to get the railways and to cut Sumy, let's say, from Kiev. And of course, the Russians, due to the significant concentration of forces, would try to attack the Ukrainians on the line Suja to Yunakivka. So this is exactly what is going to happen during the next few days. But important statement, another important thing that we need to understand: all these things might not come true, we will not see these things if the Ukrainians manage to concentrate significant number of forces, and basically the Ukrainians can, let's say, block the Russians along the border and not to allow them to cross and to capture the villages. So this is the situation from Sumy. Now let's move to Kharkiv area. We have lots of updates from this territory as well. The Ukrainians during the previous night continue hunting and destroying the Russian positions inside of Gluboka. On this video we can see a significant number of FPV drone strikes on the Russian forces, and mainly the Ukrainians, which is very interesting, were attacking and destroying the Starlink equipment. So this is the situation, this is the reality. The Russian sources continue reporting about additional attempts to attack the fields and the tree lines to the west of Zelena, but as we can see, yet without any progress on the ground or without any adjustments of map. Now let's move to Volchansk. We continue receiving quite opposite reports. As you can see, according to geolocations, the main activity took place in the eastern part, when, let's say, concerning the industrial zone, the aggregatny plant, according to the Russians, they continue offensive operation in this direction, and as a result of another wave of attack, they managed to improve their positions and to reach the outskirts of the main, let's say, stronghold in the area, and the Russians are about to begin the storm. So we'll see. If they're about to begin the storm, then sooner or later this assault operation should be finished, which probably will take place tomorrow or the day after. And in the case of the eastern part of Ovchansk, we have a lot of geolocations, mainly published by the Ukrainians. First of all, we have report, according to the Russians, that the Ukrainians made significant number of attempts to counterattack in the eastern direction, but those attacks were repelled by the Russians. And before those attempts to attack, first the Ukrainians were bombing the Russian positions. We have the video of 82nd Brigade of how they were hunting and attacking the Russian forces in this part of Volchansk, and we have the videos published by Deep State, how the Ukrainians were FPV droning the Russians also in this part of Volchansk. Both videos confirms the Russian progress, and both videos confirms the positions, the edge positions of the armed forces of Russian Federation in this direction. So while the Russians are attacking the industrial zone, the Ukrainians are trying to counterattack on the east. Now let's move to the south of Volchansk. The Russians established complete FPV drone and Lancet control over the main supply roads. The Ukrainians tried to bring some additional reinforcements and reserves, but everything can be discovered and everything can be destroyed without any problems from the Russian side. Kupiansk direction, we haven't received anything important. Let's say Siversk direction, the same story, just regular activity, artillery activity. And the next area with significant progress and very important updates is the Ocheretino direction, more precisely the western Ocheretino direction. Starting this morning, we got significant number of updates from pro-Ukrainian sources, neutral sources, and pro-Russian sources about additional Russian progress to the west of Ocheretino, and that currently, according to information we have, the Russians control around more than 50% of the village by the name of Novooleksandrivka. And according to pro-Ukrainian sources, this is approximately the territory that was captured by the Russians, and this approximately the territory that is already under Russian control. But as of Russian report, according to the Russian sources, they managed to move even further to the west, and according to Russian sources, this territory is already under complete Russian control. Of course, significant difference. I believe that the Russian sources give us more accurate information. And if it's true, then we can say that the Russians already control around 80% of the village, and the battle for this stronghold is about to be finished. Of course, significant progress. The day is going to be very interesting, so let's follow the updates. And that's it for the short video. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching. Subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye-bye.